while I'm waiting for the shock absorber to be delivered, it gives me opportunity to do a few of the minor things on the bike. This is a rear hugger, and actually it's quite marked out, which is what they do. They take quite a little bit of punishment. It's all scuff there on the edges. This is colour's completely gone. But the most concerning, which is what I had on the 1200, though you won't see it, there are cracks appearing here. So if they break, of course, the hugger's gone. They're not the most expensive thing, but if you wanted a carbon fibre one, they're about £280. I can skin it with carbon fibre, which I did before. It's quite a satisfying process, not that cheap, about £60 in materials, but it makes it incredibly strong. And if I can carbon fibre over these holes, this will be really, really strong. Any beginnings of cracks there will sort it out. So the first thing I've done is make a little jig. You notice I've just bolted it on a piece of MDF, put it in my vise, so it's very, very firm. And now the problem is when I use the carbon fibre, I end up covering these screws, so I've got to think about that. Take one out, bring it down, put a hole through, something like that. But you need it firm. So the first thing I have to do is sand the hole. I'm only doing the outside, of course. The inside is perfect, actually. The outside needs sanding down with 150 grit all over to give it a key. I said 150 grit. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. It's 120 grit you need to start with. Easy Composites supply everything you need, and they do a selection of sandpapers, and when you've got a small job, that's the best way to get. So they give you what you buy, all the sandpapers you need, a couple of sheets of each, or maybe it's one sheet of each. This is very coarse, of course, and that's what you need. It's got to completely stretch up the surface everywhere to give it a chance for the resin to bind. I've washed it, I just need to dry it, let it dry. You can see there were high spots. And there's a good key on that all over, ready to take the black base coat, which is next. It's now thoroughly dry. First of all, we need to cut the carbon fibre to some sort of shape to cover the item. This is quite delicate. Carbon fibre is very delicate. You've got to treat it like a sheet of silk, really. Very, very careful. I bought a square metre, which is I think about £18, £16, so you can do a lot with a square metre. You need to cover the edge, so I want to cover everything in one go. So I need to cut about there. So let me cut one dimension first. Now, allowing me plenty, I can cut the next straight. Don't stretch it. This is Easy Composites XCR black epoxy base coat resin. You need the hardener, the epoxy hardener, and it's mixed one of these to a third of these, or 100 to 33 as it says on the actual pots itself. The measuring has to be very precise. You've got to mix it thoroughly. The fun part now, painting a thick coat of the black base coat. You don't want it to run, but you want it quite thick. And there it's complete. 2 to 3 hours until it's just the right stickiness. That's a very delicate operation of laying on the fibre. On the biggest area first. Gently with your gloves. 2 hours have passed. I can now put the first coat of resin on. What I tend to do is just trim off most of the excess first. So again, I mix the resin. Let me try with 21 grams of the resin. No, it's going to be too little. Let me try 30 resin and 10 hardener. So there we are. It goes a long way, but this coat takes more than any of the others. You stir it slowly but thoroughly. Keep going around the edge. You must get it all mixed up, otherwise you're going to get pockets of resin that will not harden off. You'll be in a mess. So now you begin to coat it. Lots of thin coats. That's the first coat, complete. Hope I've got no fibres in the actual surface. So that stays for 8 hours now, overnight, before we sand it down with 120 again, believe it or not. So what begins to look quite good is actually then sanded down. And all this job is about is sanding, resin, sanding, resin, sanding, resin, with finer and finer sandpaper. And then when it's all done, it's polished with a cut-in paste and polished and polished and polished. It's almost a 5-day job. This is the next day and everything is dried very well. Got to be very careful handling it because where the resin has made the carbon fibre stiff on these edges, it's like scalpel blades. You have to cut it with a Dremel. You can't cut it with a scalpel or anything like that because it's very sharp. So you've got to run around, which is my next job. Around intricate parts, I find these flush snips are really useful because they're sharp enough. It's very slow, but they cut in. So these snippets are actually really good for doing this. The Dremel is great for clearing lots of it, but it's very ferocious. Whereas these, you can just take your time, snip around it. Wherever the resin set it, it's like a hypodermic needle, so until I sand it, you've got to be very careful. But there it is, it's taking shape now. And you think, oh, well, that's it, that's carbon fibre, but there is so much more to do until it's a high gloss finish. But the strength it gives to it, those will never break now. Absolutely solid. So now I start with the 120 grit. Let the sanding begin. It's now the next day and I mix the first resin to go on after the initial one. Just doing 21 grams of resin and 7 grams of hardener. And we do 3 coats thin, one after the other every 2 hours. So you've got to time your day to make sure that you don't allow it to go past it. It's roughly 2 hours. It's got to be just tacky. If you look at Easy Composites website, which I'll put in the link, there are loads of videos. And this is one on skinning, and he's skinning a rifle for a sportswoman. These sort of Olympic rifles they use, and he's skinning the whole of the wooden barrel. It's amazing what he does there. So he teaches you how to do it, but you've got to time it right, and it's between 1.5 and 2 hours. You've got to keep feeling it, and you've got to get it just right before you put the next coat on. So this is coat number 1. Coat 1 of 3 coats, very carefully mixed. Well, 2 hours have passed and it's just sticky. So the second coat is going on, which was exactly like the first coat, so there's no point in showing you it all. And then I do it a third time in 2 hours' time. Here is the rear hugger with its 3 coats of resin, and it needs a tremendous amount of sand in there to flatten it all off. Looks very glossy, but it's got to be smoothed right down. It's quite a big job to do that now. We start with 120 again. Seems very aggressive, but you've got a lot of work to do to be able to flatten it as best we can. Well, I'm a good couple of hours into sanding now. This is really, really hard work, so please don't be put off by it. You have to get it totally flat. The sanding is finished. That has taken all afternoon, probably about 3 hours in total with 120 and then finally 240 grit to be able to get rid of any scratches. I don't think I can go any further. So it has one final coat, a very thin coat of resin. So that's the final coat. At this stage you tend to think you've finished. It's beginning to look really good, but you haven't. Now you start with 400 grit sandpaper, then you go on to 800 grit, and then 1200 grit. After all of that, you then start on polishing compound that is a cut-in paste, and after all of that you polish it and buff it, so there's still a lot of work. 400 grit sandpaper to start with. It's all done wet, so you have a bowl of water that you keep changing, and it is what you think you're doing is destroying a beautiful surface. But of course you get little dots of dust that dry in the resin, and you need to flatten it down in that way. This is after 30 minutes with 400 grit paper, and you think you've destroyed the whole thing. All that shine has gone. You don't think, and I've been here a few times, you don't think there's any pattern left, and we're not putting any more resin on. But now we start with the 800. So here we are with the 800 grit, all wet. Everything from now on is wet. Gives it a very fine sanding. Not that you can see any difference, but that's the 800 finish now. So I've gone over and over it with 800 till it's so smooth. Now I go to 1200, which is almost equivalent to sanding it with your hand. But it's the final smooth one before we start on actual cutting compound. That is the 1200 finished and dried. There's very little pattern to be seen, it's just a totally flat grey. Now I come on to polishing compound. So it's like a putty, and you can do it by hand. And this gets rid of all the spots, but now I can use a machine at long last. It's a completely different hugger, stronger, much nicer looking. So I've just got to drill the holes where it fits on the bike. I can't fit it yet because of the wheel still being off, the silencer being off, waiting for the new rear shock.